And it's essentially very similar to what in Buddhism is the Heart Sutra, which is no eyes, no ears, no hearing, no tasting, no touching. Nothing that we say adequately expresses the nature of this experience or this transcendence. That's there in the Heart Sutra in Buddhism. It's there in mystical theology. You take the two and you put them next to each other, and they seem very, very close.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Allegory podcast. This time, I have a very special guest, Arthur Versluis, if I pronounced that correctly. Feel free to correct me, but I read one of his books, Platonic Mysticism, which I have right here, and I really enjoyed it. I recommend to everyone that is either interested in Plato in general, the legacy of Plato, but also mysticism, and obviously if you share all three, then definitely check it out. I was very impressed. It's very readable, but also very scholarly, very well done, very well written. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. So Arthur, thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure.
Well, thank you for the conversation. I'm looking forward to it. And as to Platonic mysticism, it's an unusual book because it's uh, an academic book, but at the same time has an appeal to the general reader. It's not strictly academic the way in the way many things these days are, very dry or but this is different. This is a different kind of book, and it really has struck a chord with readers. So I look forward to talking about it.
Awesome. And most people that listen to this podcast, they're fairly well read compared to the average person. So like they're already familiar with Plato, at least the basics. But I'm just curious on how you typically get started with Plato. So like with your students, for example, I don't know at level you teach at exactly, but assuming that you have to introduce someone to Plato and you have just a few minutes, like what do you think is the best angle that makes people take Plato seriously and take ancient philosophy serious in a way that doesn't alienate them, basically?
Well, I teach a course called Magic and Mysticism. It's an undergraduate course, and I'm teaching it right, well, just this past semester. And in that course, we do cover Plato. We not a great deal, but I introduce the name Plato to them. And one of the things we look at is uh, the the allegory of the cave, and in particular, I have some images of that allegory which really resonate with them. They can understand it in a kind of intuitive way and apply it to our world, in which so much of what we see is flickering shadows in the media world, and so they can immediately resonate with that. But I would say the majority of my students have never heard the name Plato. They simply don't even know who this is, and that's not unusual. That's kind of normal in the contemporary society, at least contemporary American society.
So, sorry to interrupt. What's their background? What are they studying?
Well, they're from all over the university. So typically I'll have 70 students roughly in a course like that, which is quite high. That's a fair number of students, but not so many that it's unmanageable. And they're from all over. They often they're extremely intelligent students who are just intrigued by a title for a course like Magic and Mysticism, which is really under the surface actually a history of Western civilization. Really, that's what it is. but it's in terms of these themes. And so, under the radar, as it were, I get in an entire, uh, history of Western civilization, including Plato, um, without, of course, going very far beyond religion and philosophy. But still, that is the essence. That's the center of Western culture, and so that's uh, an enjoyable part of the course, actually, to me, and it appeals to a lot of different students.
Right. Okay. And it's kind of crazy to me that someone might, go. I mean, obviously they're undergrads, so obviously we have to be a bit lenient on that. But still, the fact that no one has heard of Plato ever, like to me, that's kind of crazy, and that actually segments very nicely to the very next question that I wanted to ask, which is like, why was Plato forgotten? Because clearly it has been forgotten a lot. Now, obviously, I mean this a little bit more in an academic context, so like philosophy proper, so like not the average undergrad. But yeah, I was just like from your take of like when you step back from a historical perspective, and also when you see the context of modern university, modern philosophy departments and whatnot, like Plato is I feel like just not taken seriously like at all. Like everyone knows it, they might even study it, but a lot of times, um, yeah, it's just not taken seriously. A lot of it, there's a big focus on describing Plato on like the forums, which I think is important, but I feel like the spirits of kind of Plato's cave is actually a lot better, which you also spoke. That's kind of like how you introduced the topic. And I have a feeling that people just think, oh, Plato equals forms, forms equals metaphysics, therefore Plato isn't relevant anymore. Maybe they take it a bit more serious within kind of like the philosophy spirit of Socrates that comes through Plato. But yeah, overall, it just seems like he's fading into obscurity. So I really loved your take on why you think that is and how it happens.
Well, there are two aspects. One is uh, there's a fairly widespread set of seriously mistaken ideas that get replicated. And so, about Plato, and one of those is dualism, setting up a kind of a set of false assumptions about where Plato was coming from. But then also, uh, it's not only Plato, it's the entire Platonic tradition that is eclipsed. I have a chapter in Platonic mysticism called the Eclipse, and the eclipse is really what we're talking about, where uh, Plotinus, I spent years, um, where 3 years roughly, where primarily I was reading Plotinus, and the entire Platonic tradition has been eclipsed in certainly in contemporary philosophy for the most part. I'm at a state university. There's lots of analytical philosophers and so on, but there's really nobody who deals with the Platonic tradition as a whole. Other than myself, I'm in a religion department. And of course, my view of Plato and Platonism is shaped by my interest in religion. What I'm interested in are the mystery traditions, uh, and the intersection of those with Platonism, Platonic theurgy, theurgic traditions, and aspects of that. So my own interests are pretty wide, but tied to religious themes in terms of Platonism. And this, there are scholars, of course, who, internationally who still keep up the good fight and continue the living tradition of Platonic uh, inquiry and writing about Platonism, but there are not a great many. And that's just how it actually is. So why is that? Well, in part because we have a overall global civilization is extremely materialistic and looks primarily at things that can be understood in a materialistic paradigm alone. That is the predominant mentality. And so that's an important reason that Platonism is in Eclipse. That single pervasive aspect, which we often overlook. I'll give you an example of that. Uh, the left, uh, there's another name for Marxism, and that is dialectical materialism. So the left tends to come from a materialistic perspective, and then what is often called the right, which is highly associated with capitalism, is also materialistic. And so you have this kind of eclipse of Platonism in general, and then an eclipse of mysticism in particular. Um, and so those two things are separate, but they're related. So that's what this book is about in part.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, I feel like that was a great breakdown. And we spoke about the forms earlier. That's also something that I wanted to pick your brain a little bit better. So, like, first of all, to me, the forms have always seemed to me like a, it has this duality, funny enough to me, which is like, to some sense, they feel like they don't have that much prominence in like Plato's work. Like he never makes like a full I think in the laws or something that I never read, but I think he goes a bit deeper. But like it's never like a fully fledged philosophical system as far as I understood it. But at the same time, to me, it almost feels like it's the core of philosophy to some degree. Like it's the one on the many, and it's like it's about the way that I see it is how consciously operates. Like how do you recognize something as something? And to me, that feels so fundamental to cognition. I'm actually always mind blown how no one really seems to pay attention in philosophy. I would say even in cognitive science that I feel like a lot of people should be a bit more Platonist in their thinking. But I'm just curious, like how do you see the impact, and if maybe I'm kind of like overstating it, or how do you see it? And then I would also love your take a little bit on the dualism aspect of Plato. And my understanding, and maybe you covered this a little bit um, on the book. I read it a few months ago, so it's not super fresh on my mind. But the idea that I have is that you can have a bit more freedom on how you interpret Plato himself, and it's not exactly clear like the level of duality he held to some degree. But then once you reach like Middle Platonism and like late Platonism, that they're really trying to, as far as I understood it, to just like have this merge of really like form and matter, let's say, where it's really kind of like an interconnected thing, and that you really in reality there is no dualism exactly, which you kind of, I remember you unpacked this in the book a fair bit, the specific points. So I would just love your kind of takes on this whole issue of the forms.
Well, the uh, tradition concerning that uh, theme is not really primary to what I'm writing about in Platonic mysticism, which is about mysticism, that is direct spiritual insight. Uh, and that then, when you start from that point, which you see running this theme of mysticism, of direct spiritual insight, you see that in Plotinus. So you see that in uh, Platonism more broadly, and then it gets conveyed into Christianity in the figure of Dionysius the Areopagite. And here is where you do see something like the forms, which is the celestial hierarchy. He has this work on celestial hierarchies and this kind of movement from you could call it movement from the physical to the transcendent. and from the transcendent to the physical. And so there's an underlying understanding that those two are related. In other words, in a dry kind of abstract way, talking about or writing about the forms is not as uh, essential to what I'm writing about in this book as is the idea of uh, being able to move from separation to unity. Plotinus writes about this a number of times, and he writes about his own direct experience, uh, which he sometimes likens to the dawn, to the sun rising, and to light, illumination. And that set of metaphors about illumination is there in Dionysius the Areopagite, who is the Platonic fountainhead, you could say, or source for mysticism throughout the Christian tradition. And so this is a longer way of saying that the concept of forms is subordinate to the relationship between transcendence and immanence. And forms or archetypes are an intermediary and also a medium. So, from the point of view of celestial hierarchy, this would be angels. This is angelic hierarchy, and the angels have different levels, different spheres, but also different levels. And so, this movement from uh, us, immanence, duality, to transcendence, unity, is essential to this entire mystical tradition. And the forms are an intermediary aspect of that. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And by the way, sometimes I'm going to throw you some questions that I know are not exactly um, like your main concern in the book, but to some degree, it's more of like a selfish motive, given that I have an expert here in Platonism, and I like it so much that I'm just trying to, yeah, just learn a little bit more about some of the topics that kind of come to mind and that I'm interested. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense of like putting the forms in a broader perspective. Um, and also when you spoke about like Plotinus and unity, um, obviously this notion of the transcendence and also the notion of unity is very universal across like religious and mystical traditions. But maybe I'm oversimplifying, so feel free to correct me and expand it as you see fit. But I have the impression that a lot of times in Neoplatonism, there's this not needs, but like this very explicit goal where the goal is contemplation in order to be merged with the one, let's say. And so it kind of becomes this issue where that's why it's not exactly Gnostic, but it's always like always on the border of Gnostic a little bit, I feel. So it's kind of like yeah, it's not fully there, but like halfway there. And you see this a lot with Buddhism as well, again with massive oversimplifications. And I feel like to me, when I see some strands of the Christian tradition, something that I find always quite interesting is that obviously there's the desire towards unity, towards God, let's say, but also that there's a proper hierarchy of being where it doesn't necessarily mean that the lower is worse, right? So like there can be unity, there can be a desire towards unity, but also that multiplicity isn't bad, that it has a role to play in creation. So I'm just curious of like how do you see these ideas kind of interplay, and if maybe I'm oversimplifying or mischaracterizing kind of the tradition of Neoplatonism in overemphasizing the unity.
Well, those are really interesting points that you raised there, or observations. And the first thing I'll say is that uh, I actually have a book that came out fairly recently, a couple of years ago, called American Gnosis. And it's a book about what I call neo-Gnosticism in contemporary society. And when you look back in into antiquity, and you look at uh, the interconnections between Gnosticism and Platonism and Hermetic tradition. So you see the overlap of those. So for example, in the Nag Hammadi library, you see some Platonic and some Hermetic works, and there's a lot of crossover between those. It's not like they're completely separate or separatable traditions. They're all overlaid and interconnected, and obviously they're part of the same collection in the case of the Nag Hammadi. So that's the first thing I would say is there is definitely crossover, especially, and this is the second thing, in terms of transcendence. So, for example, you look at Basilides, you look at the some of the fragments of Basilides, his work that we have, or for instance, Gospel of Thomas, where there are these enigmatic sayings pointing towards the transcendence of duality. These exist in Gnosticism, even though uh, the way Gnosticism has been depicted in the 20th century, starting with Hans Jonas and then other figures as well, that really emphasize the duality, the separation, and this all kinds of things that are really not there necessarily, or not clearly there in the certainly in the entirety of Gnosticism. So there's a kind of a falsification of what Gnosticism is. But when you go back and look at the original text, you can see that there are crossovers with Platonic tradition, even though famously there's apparently an opposition between Plotinus and the Gnostics, uh, which is there in some of his work, at least one chapter. Still, there's a lot of crossover, and when you look at Buddhism, and I do this, I allude to this in the book. The book is really Platonic mysticism is really about mysticism. It's about the experience of transcendence that you see in Dionysius the Areopagite in his work Mystical Theology, which is very much Platonic. And it's essentially very similar to what in Buddhism is the Heart Sutra, which is no eyes, no ears, no hearing, no tasting, no touching, nothing that we say uh, adequately expresses the nature of this experience or this transcendence. That's there in the Heart Sutra in Buddhism. It's there in mystical theology. You take the two and you put them next to each other, and they seem very, very close. And then you look at some of the Platonic tradition. It leads to and points toward what you see in Dionysus, and that recurs again in mysticism later with figures like John Scotus Origena, or, for example, Meister Eckhart, or even Burma, even Jakob Burma, all the way up to a figure like contemporary figure like relatively recent, like Franklin Merrill Wolff, who was very much influenced also by Hinduism and other traditions, but he fits in this line. And then certainly Bernadette Roberts. So there's a kind of continuous lineage of this kind of apophatic mysticism that goes right straight back to Dionysius the Areopagite, and before that to the Platonic tradition. And that's really what I focus on in this book. And as far as I know, it's really still the only book that deals with this in this way. Certainly the only contemporary book that deals with this tradition in this way. So it was exciting to write. It really was, and very enjoyable. And I enjoy reflecting back on it as well. I haven't written anything subsequent to it, that really integrates with it. But I can imagine doing an update down the road. Uh, so that's a really enjoyable book to work with.
Yeah, awesome. I'm looking forward if you manage to to do some updates on it, or like some work that kind of builds very heavily on it. And yeah, it's also great to hear that it was a joy to write, because it was a joy to read as well. So definitely highly recommend it. And to switch back a little bit, another thing that I was curious about is obviously, on the subtitle you have contemplative science, philosophy, literature, and art. And I'm curious about the topic of literature and arts, which in my head I always put literature under art. I don't know if maybe that maybe you feel differently, but when I think about art, I think it in those very general terms. And you kind of speak about kind of this transformative aspect of art. And something that I wanted to uh, kind of inquire you about is, how do you then place that within a uh, let's say a somewhat traditional, like Platonic context of how they view arts. And that topic alone is a bit big, so I'll scope it down a little bit. Of, for example, the very famous claim of Plato that poets are banished or something from the Republic. I always found that very interesting, because it's very unexpected when you're reading it. If you don't know that you're going to encounter it, like no one would ever expect that. I think it's just it's very odd, especially from our modern culture. And I've always tried to think quite heavily, like what that means, and like what exactly he had in mind. And especially because, like you, I do put a lot of value in art, and I do view it as this way of disclosing the world. I've been very influenced by Heidegger, and also the way that he frames his views on technology. I think those are quite helpful, and I also bring that to art, which he also does that to some degree, although a bit more implicitly. And one of the things that you kind of get from that lens is kind of like that there's this way of revealing the world that you get out of art and technology, but also that's ambivalent. That it's kind of like, it's a specific way of seeing at the world, and also that it can go several different directions. And one of the things that I often think about when kind of like thinking through Plato and art is, one, the positive aspect of it, which is, you know Plato describes beauty as kind of like this thing that anyone can apprehend, right? Like, it doesn't require a big intellect or something. It doesn't require education. It's something that you can grasp right there. And then that leads to the good. And so in one sense, you can think of it as kind of like the doorway into philosophy, into God, however you want to put it. But at the same time, he does have this notion of just like, you have to be careful with art. And the way that I think about it is that like beauty can also be misleading. Like there's a dark aspect to beauty, which is like you can be seduced, for example. Like even the etymology of seduction is already negative, and it's very associated with beauty. And so that's a big ramble, but I'm just trying to give you a little bit of context of like how I approach art and how I view it in relationship to Plato. And I would love your take on it, that you have much broader kind of philosophical and historical background to these questions.
Yeah, well, it's these are all interesting, you know, fascinating themes that you're bringing up, and what I would say in terms of the book is that an example of the kind of art that reflects this tradition I'm discussing in the book, which is what I call Platonic mysticism. It's this tradition of uh, transcendence that you see in the work of, for example, Meister Eckhart or Dionysius the Areopagite, which is also illumination. And I connect this in the book to, for instance, what's called the Hudson River School. The Hudson River School is a school of painting that brings us the cover of the book. Actually, the cover of the book is a Hudson River School painting. And there's a second name for the Hudson River School, which is a 19th century American school of painting that included typically huge canvases. Painters like Frederick Church, for example, uh, painted these images of pristine nature or of initial human settlement in a wild area or mountains. But what makes it so extraordinary, this school and these works, what makes them so extraordinary is what the second name for this school is Luminist. It's called the Luminist School, and Luminist because in the images, and I actually have some in the living room here, where all of the images, framed images, the paintings, are luminous paintings, where you see this light coming in this kind of transformative way through the painting. Often in one corner, there's a sun, and then this kind of luminous green. And so the reason that I draw on this school and refer to it is that it is a visual manifestation of this tradition. It's a visual manifestation of light in matter, light in relation to darkness, transcendence and immanence. And it's analogous, I would say it's analogous to some poets. I don't discuss Rilke, for example, in this book, but Rilke's, Sonnets to Orpheus, he does this as well. There's this kind of interplay between transcendence and immanence that's implicit in his work, and it's also Orphic in the sense of uh, transcendence in nature. And this is a tradition that goes back to Romanticism. You see it in English Romanticism, German Romanticism. Um, you see it also in the American Transcendentalist movement. All of these are examples of what I'm discussing in the book, manifesting in terms of literature, manifesting in terms of art. And so I give examples like this because they give you the vision, in some sense, a visual representation of how light manifests and how light, the relationship between us and illumination uh, can be understood in terms of art and in terms of poetry. So that's really where I'm coming from in terms of the book, is not only discussing this apophatic mystical tradition, but also how it manifests in society and culture in different ways in terms of philosophy, literature, and art, and also contemplative science. One of the things one reviewer wrote about this particular book, which has always stuck with me. Uh, Viewer said, "If a book like this can be published today, there's still hope." There's still hope for academia and the publishing academic publishing world, and I know exactly what he meant. I really appreciate that remark because I know what that means. And what it means is that still something like this can be published that explores themes like this, themes like transcendence and freedom and literature and art, not in terms of the kind of decadent and corrupted way that in contemporary society we often refer to art, but art as what it can be, which is manifesting and drawing us toward transcendence in a kind of uh, the enigmatic way that beauty can do that. Beauty and truth and goodness are linked together with good reason. I agree with you in terms of the seductive nature of beauty, and at the same time, true beauty manifests also that which is true and good. So those are things that I would remark on.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thanks for that. And I had no idea about kind of like all that context of the painting school. That's quite cool. Um, so yeah, so now transitioning to a little bit uh to more mysticism directly. Something that has always been on my mind a lot that I still get quite confused about, and maybe you can help me unpack, is the role of Kant in mysticism. I feel like a lot of times I don't know which way to pull, which is there seems to be like two different interpretations, so to speak, and I don't know exactly how this played out historically, which is to some degree you can think of like the Kantian tradition and Kantian's work as like somewhat sympathetic towards mysticism in the sense that there is a reality that's always beyond, and if it's always beyond, you can always strive towards it, right? Like to me, it always generates almost automatically kind of like this vertical hierarchy that you see throughout mysticism and very, very universal. But at the same time, like I think I've seen people sometimes arguing that would completely go against Kant in some way, because the point of Kant was, okay, there's a veil, but also the point is you can't go behind the veil. So like mysticism just like completely gets destroyed under that perspective. But surely those two things can't be true because they're the opposite of each other. So I'm just curious on like how you personally position Kant's thought in kind of like how mysticism progressed.
The mystical tradition that this book, Platonic Mysticism, focuses on is primarily Christian. Uh, and so I trace that through uh, through the history to the early 20th century, when there was still a kind of consensus, and then it largely was eclipsed and disappeared. Kant as a figure, I don't find very helpful in terms of understanding this specific tradition of mysticism. Uh, Someone I find much more congenial actually is Schelling. Schelling is often depicted as this philosophical writer that doesn't really intersect with this mystical tradition. And unlike Kant, Kant, generally speaking, you could say this the second interpretation that you mentioned is the one that I think is valid. That is that he is uh, essentially saying that mysticism is impossible. We're kind of stuck in this subjectivity, and that's the end of that. Whereas with somebody like Schelling, uh, he's often depicted as an completely independent philosophical author without recognizing that behind him, embedded in his work, is certainly the mystical tradition of Jakob Böhme. There's no doubt about that, really, when you look closely at Schelling's work. And also when you look at some of his work, like Clara, this kind of uh, fictional work that he wrote, it becomes clear that there's a mystical dimension in that that's very closely allied with this mystical tradition I'm discussing in the book. And with someone like Schelling, you also have I actually went to the island of Samothrace some years ago, and I eventually wrote a book about that and about the mysteries, book called Entering the Mysteries. And one of the things during the time I was writing that book, it refers in the book to every single classical reference uh, on the mysteries and what the mysteries were in antiquity. And to my surprise, in putting together that book, um, I discovered that Schelling had written about the mysteries at Samothrace. And not only that, he understood the mysteries in a way that very few people did. So, what I would say is someone like Schelling is really entering the work of Schelling is like opening a door into a whole vista, whereas somebody like Kant is shutting the door and walking away. And Schelling to me is far more provocative. At the same time, I have to warn people that Schelling and others who are like him or allied to him, like Franz von Baader, their language is so sophisticated. It is so complex. Their references are so wide ranging that it's very, very challenging in a way that uh, not so much that we're familiar with in the contemporary world is. So I have to mention that because, I say, well, Schelling is great. And then you start reading him and you say, holy cow, this is pretty rough. It's pretty challenging. That is true. But it opens up to great vistas. That is for certain. And there is a great deal in Schelling in particular, but then others that we could talk about that is well worth exploring and very profound. So that's what I would say in relation to your question about Kant.
Yeah, awesome. No, that was great, and I know nothing about Schelling whatsoever, so this was very interesting. And since you spoke on the mysteries, something else that I wanted to cover is that something that I always find very interesting in this kind of like tradition, I suppose, or a significant theme in this kind of tradition is that the transformation always involves like a going down of some kind. Like you go to the underworld to some degree. And I always find that fascinating. And it's something that I try to grapple with a lot. And I vacillate from time to time on what exactly this means. And this is also quite important to me because I do a lot of reading and writing about psychedelics. That's part of kind of what my PhD in philosophy that I'm doing right now about. And there's also a very significant theme of that. But it's also especially interesting to me because if you trace that all the way back, then you have Plato and again the allegory of the cave, which is obviously all about ascension, all about the transformative power and getting higher and higher into reality. But it has a very peculiar context where you're already down. Like you don't go into the underworld to some degree. You are in the underworld, and then you realize it. You have like this flash of insight somehow that Plato doesn't explain, and then you have the ascent. But then when you consider the tradition more broadly, a lot of the times it does have this mythological framing, also in a lot of the rites, as far as I'm aware, of that first there's kind of the negative, and then there's the the culmination. I think Dionysus has this as well. If maybe I'm not confusing it with something else, where it's kind of like when you first meet God or like right before you meet God or something, that there's kind of like this state that's negative or like completely neutral or something. Maybe I'm not describing it correctly. I'm confusing it with someone else. But either way, I'd like to ask you, like, what do you think the meaning of this is? Of like putting it in the simplest, broadest sense possible, the fact that you have to go down before going up on the path of mystical transformation.
Well, there are different things we could talk about in relation to that. One of those is uh, in the works of the Christian theosophers who were around 1600, starting around 1600 to maybe 1700s, early to mid 1700s, primarily, uh, including Jakob Böhme, who died in 1624. With the Christian theosophers, uh, there is there are always references to having to go through a kind of gauntlet or a set of challenges or assaults even. This is in there's English theosopher in this tradition by the name of John Portage. And Portage wrote about this directly, that early in his mystical path, he felt, he and his wife, he had married his wife because of their shared mystical relationship. And they together suffered these kinds of assaults and darkness and manifestations of things that were really grueling and shocking, and then came out the other side. And he ultimately was, it's said by one of his colleagues, was able to go into a state of, you could call it contemplation. It sounds trance-like because it lasted up to 2 weeks at a time, where he would be in this kind of suspended state. And some of his books are about what he experienced during this kind of this, you could say, out of body experiences, this kind of uh, these kinds of journeys that he went on. You could say angelic journeys, or however you want to call it. And that might be understood as a kind of um, opposite to, or a result of, the kind of grueling experience that he went through at the beginning with his wife. That because it was so grueling, then later in life, these other possibilities manifested. So that's an example in the case of John Portage. But when you go back to the ancient mysteries, of course, you're absolutely right. It was literally in darkness that one went into darkness, had these alarming experiences that caused fear and anxiety and anguish, and then suddenly illumination. This is what we know. There's not a great deal about the what happened during the mysteries, because people were sworn to silence and pretty much kept to that. But you still do have accounts and references, and there are archaeological remains where people left behind from the mysteries their statements that sometimes carved into different um, uh, remains, artifacts that we have. And there are some things that we know about the mysteries in a general way, and one of them is exactly what you're talking about: going into the darkness and then illumination. And that's in some way what I'm also describing with Burma, and certainly with Portage and figures like that. Uh, John of the Cross, with the Dark Night of the Soul, would be another example of that. Uh, so this is a constant theme within the mystical tradition. It recurs, but not always. So, for example, you look at a figure like Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart seems to start way on the other side. Um, and so he offers these kind of illuminated, enigmatic sayings, you could say, from the other side. And he doesn't give you any idea how he got there. He's offering these sermons, which are full of like Zen koan examples of transcendence, but we don't know how he got there, really. He's not very clear about that. And with Portage, you get much more kind of detailed version of his journey. So these are some reflections on this theme of the dark night of the soul.
Awesome. Yeah, those examples are very helpful. And does that exist to a good deal on the Neoplatonic tradition?
Well, it depends who you're talking about and in relation to what, really. I think uh, Plotinus was a contemplative who really did not, he doesn't offer anything quite exactly like what I was describing in terms of Portage. And it could be that the Christian aspects, the Christian kind of context, um, helps shape why Portage's journey is like that with devils and demons and so on. You don't find that quite that same dynamic in Plotinus. And it's more movement to contemplative movement toward what he describes as the dawn or dawning or dawn of the light or the sun, illumination. Um, so I can't say that the same kinds of themes are necessarily there in uh, ancient Platonic tradition, uh, or even for that matter, necessarily in someone like Dionysius the Areopagite, who really is primarily about this contemplative ascent in some respects, very similar to Plotinus, more than to somebody like Portage, actually. Uh, so it could well be that at the beginning, the Christian tradition of this type was much closer to the Platonic or much, much more reflective of the Platonic than later mysticism. This is just an observation. I'm thinking out loud. Uh, that later mysticism tended to take on more of a dynamic quality, not a contemplative ascent alone, but also struggle. And you see that a little bit in certainly in Portage. So there are variations here in these traditions. I'm not saying they're identical.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I do think that there was something about it in Dionysus, but then I'm guessing I'm mixing with someone else, and that I can't remember this properly. But yeah, that was very helpful. Also, something that I really wanted to cover, because this is also one of the topics that I think about a lot, and I know you have a whole book on it, which I'm probably gonna try to fit that into my list to read this year, because I do think it's a quite important topic about perennialism. Try to struggle with that word for some reason. I'm just curious, like, number one, maybe like just explain a little bit your thesis of the book, like where exactly do you stand, and why you stand there, and like how do you navigate kind of like this whole debates, between exclusivism and pluralism, and all that jazz in the fields. And then lastly, I also wanted to ask you about if you can maybe place me on where I stand, because I've read some literature on this, but I don't think I've met anyone that says this explicitly, where to me, the way that I always view it is it seemed, well, this would be a larger conversation, but to simplify it, the way that I often frame religion is like a map for life and a map for enlightenment, let's say. And there's better or worse maps. And to me, that seems like an objective truth. And that's kind of, in my opinion, an argument for exclusivism, because like that automatically creates a hierarchy, like because there's a value of some kind. However, I'm also sympathetic to pluralism, because I also don't want to say which one is the exclusive one, because that requires me stepping out of the frame that I'm in, and somehow say, this is the map that's messed. Like that already includes a map, so I can't be in that position. So the way that I'm trying to explain it in my own writing is that kind of like ontologically, there's kind of like an exclusivity, but epistemologically there isn't. So I don't see anyone making that case. I don't know if maybe it's because this makes no sense, or but yeah, I'm just curious. Everything perennialism, I'm very interested in. I'm very curious on your thoughts.
Well, the book you're referring to is in some ways complementary to Platonic mysticism. That book is uh, called Perennial Philosophy, and in it, it's written in a very particular way. It's written in a way that sometimes when you write a book, the book takes on its own voice. There is a voice that is there in Perennial Philosophy, which is unique to that book. It's a particular kind of um, approach that I really like, and I know it resonates with people. It's a book that sells pretty well. It has no notes or very few notes. It's really a book not about what people think. Often people think when they hear the term perennial philosophy or perennialism, they think that what that means is that there is everything points to one thing and that they're all the same. Really, you take you know, Judaism, it's the same as Islam, and it's the same, really, they're all the same at the center. And I say at the beginning of the book, no, no, that is not what perennialism is. That's not even what this book is about. It is not about all traditions are the same or that they point to the same thing or that they have a secret center. It is rather that perennial philosophy, and this is coming out of the Platonic tradition, is really about truth. And what is true in an ultimate sense is perennial and cannot be extirpated because it's true. And this is in our society quite valuable because our society, I remember for a while, for some, years, quite a few years, I was an administrator and I was in a meeting with a dean and the dean said, well, it's all relative. Everything is what is excellence anyway? He said, what is excellence anyway? Meaning excellence, everything is relative. Nothing has any intrinsic meaning. Everything's the same as everything else. This view is very, very pervasive in contemporary society. And people will talk about my truth. I have a truth, right? This is present, but what I'm saying in perennial philosophy is very different and very much inflected by the Platonic tradition, and that is that as much as you were saying in your question, it's possible to create a map and to compare and to find what is true and what is not true. And that's kind of the purpose of maps, actually, if you think about it. You look at a map and you want to know that when you're going to Indiana, you're going to Indianapolis, this is the way to Indianapolis. And Indianapolis is real. It's not relative. It's not, it's actual. And in some sense, perennial philosophy is like that map where you are coming to understand what is true and what is not true. And that's not a particularly popular thing to say nowadays. But that doesn't mean it isn't true. Just because it's unpopular doesn't mean it's not true. And so perennial philosophy is a little bit of a rebel book in that regard, because it presents things in ways that uh, sometimes are disturbing even to people. So, for example, I was giving a talk in England actually, and many of the people that were present at the talk, their assumption was that perennialism meant that that at the center is all the same and so on. And I said, no, no, that is incorrect. That is not how I am using the term perennial here. It is that which is true. And that which is true in perennial philosophy is different than simply assuming that everything is the same. So once you get that difference, then you begin to see what I unpack in the book. And that book was a great deal of fun to write. There's actually an audio version of it that I narrated myself. And that was a fun book. And I recommend people take a look at it. I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll enjoy the style of the book. It's a style that's unique to that book, and I think it reflects back, now that I think about it, on the Platonic style. There's a little bit of a dialogic dimension to that book.
Yeah, amazing. That sounds great. I'll definitely try to fit the book in. That sounds right on my alley. And quite a natural bridge from perennialism, at least in the way that it's typically conceptualized in the mainstream, kind of like from the typical Huxley framework that people usually have in mind, is New Age spirituality. And I know that you've done a fair bit of work on that, and I'm not at all familiar with kind of like what your stance is. So I would like to explore that a little bit. And this is something that's quite dear to me because a lot of what I feel like I'm trying to read and write about and present in my work and trying to amplify to the world is the primacy of meaning, the importance of stories, and kind of like how the best way to live within that is through religious traditions to some degree. And that is what I think is a source of spirituality that is needed for all of us. And it's admittedly a very biased perspective, but it's my perspective nevertheless. However, I often struggle to make that case because people are usually completely against religion because, like, oh, this is completely nonsense or whatever, science will figure everything out and like everything that religion says is stupid. Or they say, oh yeah, sure, like the spirituality does have some meaning, and I do feel a longing for it, but I also don't want to go into any tradition. Like I want to do my own thing, right? And this has a lot of the spirit of the New Age spirituality movement, and there's a lot of it that I really don't like, but I often struggle putting into terms on why I don't like it. I think the fact that it's constructed rather than received, I think, is one aspect of it. Also the fact that it doesn't have a proper community that I think is important for like at least how mystics and how people that have tried to reach enlightenment or salvation into some degree have always said that it's important. So it's quite complex, but it always rubs me the wrong way, and it's quite interesting because I want to force spirituality so much, but then this is the direction that people go, and then I'm like, this is the wrong direction still. Like you're not quite there yet. So I would love to hear kind of your take on it and kind of like what your stance is in the work that you've done.
Well, it depends, because I've written books, different books that allude to things that fit within the category New Age. So, for example, I did a book about, 15 years ago called American Gurus. And American Gurus is really about uh, the history of spirituality in America, but also more broadly, globally, once the late 20th, early 21st century rolls around, because these figures, many of the figures, cannot be, even if they're American born, they can't be uh, only included in that context because, for example, you have a figure like Franklin Jones or Adida who declared himself enlightened and a guru and ended up in owning an island off in Fiji and living there in his compound and having a international following, as an example. Uh, but he comes out very much of an American tradition, and American transcendentalism is actually in the background. So he's an example. Is he New Age? Yeah, he kind of is. What is New Age in this context? Well, it's sort of coming out of Hinduism, kind of, except it's not really. It's sort of emerging on its own in a contemporary context. There's a lot of this kind of thing. In that book, I discuss something called the satsang network, and satsang, which is you have these people like, for example, um, this fellow who went to India for a couple of weeks and he met with a guru, couple of gurus, maybe one in particular, and he decided he was enlightened. He came back to the United States. He established a community, Enlightenment community. He um, became fairly popular, and ultimately the whole thing collapsed in scandal. Uh, where did it come from? Well, it's tangentially related to India and Indian gurus and Indian guru, but really, what is it? It's a New Age phenomenon, uh, more than it is Hindu. You can't really lay the feet of what Andrew Cohen or any of these folks had to uh, what they did at the feet only of Hinduism as such. It's a contemporary New Age set of phenomena where people sort of declare themselves a guru figure. And that's what you see in American gurus. But at the same time, uh, there are gurus. There are people who have come out of a tradition, are recognized by a teacher, are a student of a teacher, are part of a lineage that goes back, you know, hundreds of years, sometimes 1,000 years. And so, what is that we're looking at there? It's something that uses the same term, but it's not the same thing. And so, uh, I think the key difference between what we could broadly call New Age spirituality and uh, traditional is precisely in the term traditional, meaning that there's a lineage, there's a tradition, there's a lineage, there's a master-disciple relationship, there's continuity that goes over centuries. Uh, that's a very different thing than the kind of contemporary phenomenon where somebody pops out as a kind of spiritual teacher, sort of ex nihilo. And so that difference is something that maybe you saw in the past to some limited extent, but today it's really a defining set of phenomena, which I discuss in the books American Gurus and then also in the more recent book, American Gnosis. Those two books are kind of linked together. And both of those books have to do with these related themes in different ways. So that's what I would say about, about that theme more broadly.
Right. I think that's very interesting, but the way that I would frame it is slightly different because like when you the way that you speak about New Age of like this almost cult-like behavior to some degree and like these really big gurus that appear, and obviously that is a big deal, and I do think that's worth studying very seriously. But at the same time, at least from my perspective, that's not the baseline way that I would see New Age spirituality. And maybe I'm wrong, but I also have the intuition that that's not necessarily what people jump to right away. Like when I think about New Age, and if I discuss New Age with someone, what I would assume is the topic that we're talking about is more like a baseline, vague belief that functions very much in the same as a religious system of like, this is what I think reality is, this is what I think a human being is, this is what I think we should strive towards, and this is why. So it's like it's this whole set of cognitive and spiritual map, but it doesn't have necessarily like an organizational movement of some degree. So, like for example, if I were to pick, I don't know, a, a random sample here in my city of like 1,000 people, like many wouldn't be religious at all, but then some people would declare them like spiritual, but like not religious. And some of them, that's more what I have in mind when discussing New Age. Like they're probably not following anyone. They just think, I don't know, the world is energy and you need to get enlightened somehow with your 10-minute meditation on your app or something like that. So that's more what I have in mind. And I think that's actually, and I think actually that to some degree, I think that's more problematic than what you highlighted, because the fact that what you described often comes out a bit extreme, I think people are more easily like it rings alarm bells on their heads more easily. But New Age spirituality in this like more uh, vague, more innocent sense, precisely because it feels so casual. People embrace it so easily, and then they feel like they feel entitled to like do a checkbox on like their life. It's like, yeah, I'm spiritual. I believe that, I don't know, we're all one or whatever. And so this is more what I have in mind. I don't know if you have like a strong opinion on this kind of like religious sentiment that I'm speaking of, kind of like a little bit putting aside everything that you mentioned of like the more guru type phenomenon.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, and really what it uh the way it manifests is literally that there's a new age coming. That we don't really need to do that much. This is kind of classical New Age spirituality is, if you could call it classical, is um, kind of a perverse use of that term, but it is essentially believing that we don't need to do that much. There's going to be this uh, universal awakening. A new age is coming, and we want to call it Aquarius. I was surprised to see that Aquarius is still, kind of in the collective language. This idea of a collective zodiacal change or a collective um, singularity, or, in technological terms, or this kind of thinking is very prevalent in society as a whole. The new age guru figures that I was talking about kind of fit within that because they claim enlightenment sort of ex nihilo. They're just, didn't really need to go through all these practices and all this struggle and challenges and everything, just sort of boom, there it is, and I'm your guru. And that's the phenomenon which does fit in this larger context. You're absolutely right of um, it is a new age manifesting in and around us. That's literally what New Age typically means. And one of the things that also means is that we don't really need to go through this kind of set of challenging struggles ourselves so much. That's implicit in the idea of a New Age, but rather it just kind of dawns on us. And the contemplative tradition that Platonic mysticism about is not really, in general, like that. There's a path. Uh, there is a movement from uh, struggle, movement from separation and duality to transcendence and unity, from darkness to illumination, from uh, being caught to being free. All of these are kind of metaphors, and that entails a path much like you see in Buddhism. And all of these different traditions can be co-opted into a new age way of thinking. No question about that. Uh, and then it's also worth mentioning, I have a book that came out in 2025 called Breaking Through the Materialistic Deception. And in that book, I discuss how pervasive materialism is in our contemporary society. We forget. We don't. I didn't realize it myself actually, until I started to write about it and realized that really materialism is so deeply embedded that it takes an enormous effort to step out and realize it. And it affects everything and how we see everything. We see nature, material objects, resources. We even have a term, natural resources. These are objects to be used. Everything is like that. People, what are they? Human resources. They're objects to be used. Everything that we think about, everything that we see is materialistically determined in contemporary society in ways that we don't even perceive. Plato would have understood this immediately and completely because Plato's Allegory of the Cave is about exactly this. And we are living much more in a cave than at the time of Plato, I think. And that cave is materialism. And so breaking through the materialistic deception, it's a deception, it's a self-deception. It's a materialistic self-deception that we live in. And so that's one of the things that I explore in this book, uh, which is also relevant to this theme of the New Age, because much New Age thought is very materialistic. It is not really part of this grand tradition that I've been writing about in these different books. It is very much inflected by materialistic thinking. And so there's a much broader and more profound tradition, and that's what my books have been in various ways uncovering. And so, I encourage people to take a look at least at perennial philosophy and Platonic mysticism. Some of the other books are also various ways entertaining. They were entertaining to me to write, and I think for people to read as well. And in some cases, I actually embed straight up jokes in there. There's there are definitely jokes in American Gnosis, so and in some of these other books as well. So humor is also part of this. So I would I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk with you about these different topics. It's enjoyable to do.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, thanks a lot for that. That was very very good context. And it's funny how you titled that materialism book. I always find it funny when books are this blunt. It reminds me of Bernard Kostrup also has a book titled very similar, Why Materialism is Baloney, which I also think is quite funny. Um, so yeah, I don't want to take too much of your time. So I would just like one final question, if you can afford it. And what I'd like to ask is, uh, they're kind of like two separate questions, but I think they've kind of form one continuum. So feel free to pick this whatever way you want. Which is number one, I noticed that you kind of like wrote about kind of like your early life, in kind of like the farm, if I understood correctly, right? And I'm curious of like how did that shape you in a way that maybe translates a little bit to the work that you've done now. And then second, if I understood correctly again, you do have some affinity to some degree to some strands of Buddhism, if I read correctly. And to me, that was quite surprising to read because you are so heavily invested in like the Western tradition. And so yeah, I'm just curious about those two things, which I suppose at one end, it's one larger question, which is like how your personal life kind of interacts with your work.
Well, there's two aspects to that. It's true. I grew up on a farm. Grew up doing farm work with my cousins, and the farm still exists. I live on a farm, live in 40 acres, and we garden here. And I've been involved in agriculture my whole life. And I would say the one way that it directly relates to books and to my work is that uh, writing is a lot like hoeing or other farm work, in that you have to just keep doing it. It's not a matter of well, I feel inspired today, so I'm going to hoe. Um, Either you hoe or your weeds are going to take over the row and you're not going to have any vegetables. That's just how it is. And writing and exploring are related. For me, writing is also exploration. It's not just tedious, labor. There's a great pleasure in hoeing and having a clean, beautiful row, and having your strawberries, which I grew up with, by the way. We grew strawberries and would pick them. Um, and as kids, we were the ones who picked them. And there's a lot of strawberries and a lot of orchards. And also there's an element of exploration in what I do, so also on the one hand a work ethic, but on the other hand getting beyond the farm and exploring the world at large is part of what I do. It's a lot of my work is exploration. With regard to the theme of Buddhism or the subject of Buddhism, uh, when you look at contemplative practice in the contemporary world, where do you find the clearest maps? We talked earlier about maps. Well, where do you find, Plotinus gives you a pretty good map. Okay, he's not bad. But if you want really, really precise map, you're going to go to Vajrayana Buddhism or Buddhism more generally, because there it's very, very precise. And it's been put together by practitioners over an enormous period of time whose entire life was devoted to specifically chronicling and uh, uh, mapping the contemplative ascent. And so Buddhism gives you that in a way that really no other tradition does in quite that way. And so that's been part of where my work does come from, because it's shaped by that. And here I'm talking specifically about the contemplative tradition of Buddhism broadly, which you see in the sutras, but then also in texts related to Mahamudra. Mahamudra is a set of practices that ties to the nature of mind and the nature of our consciousness. And it's very clear in terms of the map that it provides. And so that's been very helpful to me, actually. So that's perhaps related to the other themes that we talked about. I allude to it in Platonic mysticism, not in great detail. I don't go into it because you're right. It's primarily about the West. And I think the West, we really need to recover and recognize our own traditions and our traditions of that we see in Platonic mysticism. I think it's critical. I think it's absolutely critical. And so that's why I wrote that book and these other books. And it shows that these things exist, that they exist, and that there's much more to be done and much more to explore. So, yes, there is without question a Buddhist dimension to, my own life and where I've come from and where I am. But I am very insistent on the importance of the West and Western tradition. And it's not a matter of simply turning one's back on that. I think it's rather a matter of coming to see where these different traditions intersect. And that's something I allude to at the end of Platonic mysticism.
Okay, amazing. That was fantastic. And yeah, just on your last reply alone, I feel like we could make an entire extra podcast just on that. And yeah, this was super fun conversation. I had so much more to go through, but as usual, there just isn't enough time. But this was absolutely amazing. I really enjoyed your book. I really enjoyed talking with you. You're absolutely lovely to have a discussion with, and obviously very knowledgeable and very wise in how you approach things. So thank you so much for coming. It was truly a pleasure.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it too. And it was a good conversation. So let's continue.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that was the end of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I think it was a lovely conversation. It was really fun and I learned a lot. I just wanted to take this opportunity here at the end to basically just talk a little bit about my own work, because every time that I'm doing these podcasts, obviously I speak about guests and their own work and their own views. But I've been writing a lot myself recently, so I just wanted to draw a bit attention to that. So if you use Instagram, feel free to reach me out at handle, Tiago Books. And then also I have all my writing on my website, which is new, tiagovf.com. I'll leave the link below. And I especially want to highlight two things. Number one, it's my book that I released last year, which is about basically a memoir, but a very philosophical memoir, and also written under the influence of psychedelics, which makes it quite unusual. So if this sounds interesting to you, kind of like a philosophy, religion, psychedelics, and also kind of like a personal journey type thing, feel free to check out that book. And then the other thing that I want to highlight is that I've very recently just published a massive technological essay series that it's on my website, that basically talks about the dangers of technology. It talks about what exactly AI is at a very deep ontological level, and what that means for us, what it means for society, and they also then relate all of this to what it means to live a good life, what it means to be human, what it means to our notions of spirituality. So everything within the realm of technology, AI, and spirituality in the deepest sense of the word, not in the shallow sense that kind of like the New Age phenomenon that we talked about here in this podcast. If any of this sounds interesting to you, then definitely check out this essay series. I highly recommend it. It's basically a book to some degree, but slightly more polished, so it kind of feels more like an essay. So if you go to my website, go to Major Works, and then you'll find it there. And yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for supporting and watching the podcast. And I'm really dedicating myself this year to having a lot of more episodes. As you've seen, I've been a lot more active lately, and that's going to continue. So thank you so much.